Our next speaker is one of our keynote speakers for the day, and he is Brian Nosek. Um, Brian is co-founder and executive director of the Center for Open Science, which operates the Open Science Framework. The Center for Open Science is a nonprofit technology organization based in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a mission to increase the openness, integrity, and reproducibility of scientific research. Brian is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia. He received his undergraduate degree from California Polytechnic State University and a PhD from Yale University. Welcome home. He co-founded Project Implicit, an internet-based multi-university collaboration between researchers and education investigating implicit cognition. Important topic today. Professor Nosek investigates the gap between values and practices, such as when behavior is influenced by factors other than one's intentions and goals. Research applications of this interest are implicit bias, decision-making, attitudes, ideology, morality, and barriers to change. He applies this scientific research to improve the alignment between personal and organizational values and practices. In 2015, Professor Nosek was named as one of Nature magazine's Nature's 10, and in the same year, the Chronicle of Higher Education added him to his influence list. Welcome, Professor Brian Nosek.
Thanks very much. You want to get me started here? I very much appreciate the invitation for this event, and hope that what I talk about is seen as very relevant to the things that the institution, the university, is working on, and Nosek there. Thank you. So the Center for Open Science was founded in 2013. It is a nonprofit technology company, as Jill mentioned, with a mission to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. And we have 4 primary activities, thank you, for that. One is meta-science, where we are conducting large-scale studies of the reproducibility of different fields, or research on just scientific practices itself, to identify areas to improve reproducibility. A second is that we conduct trainings about how to be more reproducible or open in one's research, what tools are available and how to use them effectively. A third area that gets a lot of our attention is working on the incentives in scholarship to try to align what's good for me as a scientist with what's good for science. So can we make it in one's interest to be more open and reproducible in their work? Make that part of the reward structure rather than having just focused on publication as frequently as possible in the most prestigious outlets possible. And that was the focus of my presentation yesterday. What I want to focus on today is the last thing that we do, which is most of the staff. We have about 75 people now at the center, and most of them are working on infrastructure, building tools to help open and enable greater integration and reproducibility of the entire research life cycle as public goods infrastructure for the community to use. So let me open with sort of what the organizing principle of our strategy for the research infrastructure. And that is that academic scholarship, when done for academic purposes, is a public good. That what the pursuit of knowledge is not for my knowledge unless I am pursuing competitive advantage or commercialization. But when I'm pursuing it for academic purposes, I'm pursuing it for the good of humanity to know new things that I have contributed as a researcher. So if we think of the role of scholarship as a public good, a concrete application of that is, what does it mean to have that be a public good? And there are 3 areas that we pay most attention to in openness. One is open access of the outcomes, right? The publications that result, the scholarship that comes out of what it is I found in my process of discovery, of my generation of data and interpretation of that data. Second is the theme of the day, the open data, the content of research. And not just the data in terms of the units that were generated from the methodology, but information about the methodology itself, the materials that were done, the process that was done, the code that was generated. All of that is the content of what's actually the research. As David Donahoe at Stanford said, the publication is really advertising for the research. The research itself is down here, the content of what was generated that led to that publication. And the third area we think is vital and not as much part of the conversation yet, but really is the critical part of representing that research life cycle, which is the workflow, the process of generating that data, of drawing inference, of coming up with designs. How is it that I conducted that research in order to arrive at those outcomes? And that has just as much of a role to play as the data itself that was generated. And so that really is a key part of our overall strategy of trying to open up the entire research life cycle. So let me just drill down a bit into the benefits that we perceive of open workflows to then transition into our technology strategy. One is obvious, it's in the name, it increases process transparency. How is it that I arrived at my research? If you can see my workflow, if you can see the history of my work, then you have information about that and can evaluate it. Right? It increases my accountability to how it is I draw inference. Right? If I do 500 different tests on a particular data set and only share 5 of them with you, the ones that look really good, if you can see my process of doing that, then you can decide whether that was a reasonable thing to do or not. If you don't see my process, then you don't know. And I have no accountability to other observers to how it is I generated my findings. Open workflows also facilitate reproducibility in that if you see how it is I conducted the research, you have much more information to be able to do that same thing yourself. Right? Also, it facilitates metascience. If you want to study how it is people draw scientific inferences or scholarly inferences more generally, you need to have access to how it is that those inferences are generated. And so conducting research on the research process itself requires access to the data about how the research was conducted. Moreover, it fosters collaboration in that as those workflows are open, there are more opportunities for people with expertise at different stages of the life cycle to get involved in that research process. Right? Researchers in laboratories around our university, perhaps here as well, don't think a lot about curation of their data in advance. But those are skills that are available on university campuses. Librarians have lots of curation skills that if they could get inserted earlier in the research process, could help set up data so that it is more accessible, more reusable, and better curated for future use. Also, open workflows foster inclusivity by giving more touch points for people with different areas of expertise and interest to get involved in the research life cycle. Wherever it is, they could be contributors. Moreover, that fosters innovation because as you can see more of the life cycle, there are more opportunities to identify friction points or gaps that could be addressed with different types of tools. And most critically for our purposes is that an open workflow protects against lock-in. So an easy strategy to build commercial business on research is to get researchers in at one point and keep them in the types of tools that one develops. Apple has a fantastic strategy to keep me using Apple products by connecting all those things together so that I'm dependent on them. And I thank them for it, and I keep buying more things from them. So it is a great strategy for commercialization, but it isn't a great strategy for research advancement for public goods. Because if I am locked in a particular set of tools and services, then I don't have opportunity to innovate. I don't have opportunity to bring in other services that might be most relevant to what it is I need to do. And it's then contingent on a particular provider rather than all of the potential service providers of a research ecosystem. Okay, so that sort of is the baseline core of what the open science framework aims to do. And really the representation, the process that we are trying to have an impact on reproducibility is that entire research life cycle. From the generation of ideas to the collection of that data to how it is stored and analyzed, how it is then represented and interpreted. And so all of the tools are reinforcing that. So I want to give a quick impression of what the overall strategy is and then unpack it piece by piece. We essentially are pursuing 3 layers of infrastructure to help support opening up the entire research life cycle. A base level infrastructure of the tools and services that developers create and maintain that then facilitate the creation of interfaces, ways in which researchers then engage with those tools and services in order to conduct their research at different parts of the life cycle. And then those interfaces enable branding and engagement of communities by them taking those services and having it represented for their own community with their own norms, with their own standards, with their own rules of how it is their community engages in that type or that area of research. And so what I'll do for the rest of the talk essentially is unpack each of these and show how they fit together, starting at the bottom, the sort of the core set of tools and services that the team is developing. So the first one is the toolkit. So most of the team over the last 3.5 years that we've been working has been developing a suite of open services that are composable, that represent workflow, authentication, how one gets access to a system, permissions, what different users have access to, file storage tools, file rendering in a browser, persistence in a metadatabase, integrations, connecting services together, search and discovery functionality, and the shared data set. These are composable tools so that anyone that is trying to build a new service that operates via the internet can draw on any of these pieces in order to lower the barrier to entry, make it easier and more efficient for them to create a new service, a new interface, a new way to engage researchers, but on a common framework of tools so that it is much more efficient and much more interoperable across the different tools and services that researchers create. There's a whole lot that we could talk about with that, but I just want to give you an impression of what the toolkit is, and there, if you want all of it, it's all right there. So that is critical because this is the basis of all of the things that get built on top of it. And one of the key pieces is the services ecosystem. What the services ecosystem is it's based on an abstracted API at the core of these tools and services. And the entire idea of this approach is to have any service that is connected to the open science framework is then connected to all of the other services around the research lifecycle. So for example, right now we have connections with Mendeley and Zotero as citation management tools, some data collection tools like Open Sesame, data storage environments like Google Drive or Amazon Web Services, Dropbox, GitHub, statistical analytics tools like JASP Stats, it's an open source analytics tool, and then places where people archive their data like Figshare and Dataverse. So as each service adds their connection to the open science framework, then they can speak with, interact with all of the other services in that ecosystem. And once that happens, then lock-in is prevented. If I have my data in Dataverse and then suddenly Dataverse goes commercial and bananas and they start to do things that I don't like, I can move my content out of that and instantly into another service. And I can add additional services to my workflow by just connecting different tools that I use. So those are the ones that are already completed. We gave out grants to a variety of different groups to add additional services to just demonstrate connections across the entire research lifecycle so that, for example, you can imagine someone doing their data management planning with DMP tool, and instead of that being a static document that once I get the grant, I never look at again, because why would I look at it again? I got the grant. I'm just doing my research now. Instead, that can become a living document that travels along the research lifecycle, and as the relevant items in the data plan become relevant in the research process, then we might be able to facilitate and connect that with the movement of that data into data storage devices, et cetera. So just to give one illustration of this, Notre Dame has a computational services environment for their researchers. And they were building an interface to try to connect that to different data storage environments, Box.com, Dropbox, et cetera. They discovered that we started to collaborate and identify areas of common interest. And instead of continuing on developing their own interface, they connected their computational services platform to the OSF. And then because it's connected to this API, now instantly, their computational services is connected to all of the data stores that are connected to the OSF. So they could say, call from this data storage environment, send it to our computational platform, and then output the results to the open science framework. This has a dramatic effect on efficiency because every time someone else adds their data storage environment to the OSF, then that's instantly part of their computational services platform. And they only have to maintain one relationship with the open science framework. They don't have to worry about all of the connections with all of the other services, which are continually getting updated and is a substantial technical burden. So the efficiency gains for each organization, each group involved, having a single point of contact can dramatically accelerate the connection of services more broadly. Okay, we can talk about that more if there are questions later, but I want to move on to some of the other pieces because that's really at the core of a lot of what we do. Next one is data, and I'll just talk first sort of about metadata of scholarly events. And this is primarily through our project called SHARE, and this is a collaboration with the Association of Research Libraries. And the idea of SHARE is to identify all of the different providers of scholarly events. So that might be a publication, it might be a grant award, it might be a clinical trial registration, it might be an individual researcher doing something, it might be a data set being made available in a repository. There are lots of different services that have these events occur and have some kind of alert or access point of metadata about what that event is. But they're all in their own formats. They all have different metadata styles. And so what SHARE does is it takes all of those different services and normalizes them into a single format so that there can be one pipeline of all research events of any kind where you can search against that particular, for anything from any source. Once we have that pipeline, then we are building curation tools on top of it. And so part of the key with collaboration with ARL is that there are curation associates that will connect these different research events so that that data set, oh, that's related to that publication, oh, and that grant award. And if we can just connect them together as related events, then it's a lot easier to discover. For example, if institutions want to know what their researchers are doing, then a curated data set can allow the development of discovery layers on top of that that are focused on research events by their faculty. So there are many different uses for an open data set of all research events because you can develop lots of different discovery layers on top of that. So where we are so far with SHARE is that there are 16 million events as of a day or two ago when I screenshot this, and from 126 different sources. That's institutional repositories, groups like Crossref or DataCite or Figshare, and they are all searchable through a single interface. And that SHARE data set now, because it's an open data set, can be applied to any new service that anybody builds. They can use the SHARE data set as their search engine, and that's what we use for all the services that we develop. Okay, so that's sort of the core layer of tools and services that other things that researchers need to use can be built upon. So I want to talk next about the second layer, which is the interfaces that we're developing as example cases for what researchers can build or what communities, scholarly communities can build to interact with the types of scholarship that they do. Our best known interface, and the one we've worked on the most, is at osf.io. It's also termed the Open Science Framework, but really it is an interface that is separate from those core tools and services. And so what OSF does for researchers is it's a project management environment, and it tries to draw on all of those services into a very flexible integrated system that helps researchers maintain their own research for their own purposes privately, but make it very easy to make parts of that publicly accessible. So for example, you sign up for an account as an individual. When you have an account, you go in and you have a project space. You can create projects. You add collaborators to those projects. You can drop data and materials, anything digital, into those projects. You organize them, and you have things like wikis and other management things just to maintain that project internally for your team's own use, right? A cloud-based archiving access point so that distributed teams, collaborative teams all know where to find the stuff. And it will never get lost, even if the graduate student leaves or the computer explodes. So it sort of looks like that. A second feature of it is it has a simplified version control interface. Some researchers understand and can use things like Git to engage version control with the work that they do, but that's not something that many researchers use, even though they can appreciate the value of version control. Right? Most of what version control happens in, for example, authoring is creating a single folder on one's desktop and saying, manuscript final, and then manuscript final. Manuscript, this is the final one, don't look at the other ones, right? And so there's a continuing array of these versioned articles of what it was that was being written, but it's very hard to keep track of that. This does it automatically so that every time the file gets updated, then it creates a new version, but you have access to the entire version history of that file, whatever's in the file. So it makes it much easier, lowers the barrier to entry to use things like version control for for researchers, regardless of their technology tendencies. A key part of the OSF is that it merges public and private workflows. One of the big barriers to getting into being more open with one's data and research is that most of the practices now require me to append new work to the work that I've already done. So once I get my publication, the journal says, now it would be great if you opened your data. And I think, what are you talking about? I'm done. I've got my publication. You want me to do more things now? I'm busy. I got to go on to the next publication. If instead we can integrate the preparation for open data with the workflow as it happens, then we don't have to append onto the process making one's data available. Instead, we can have an environment that I'm using for private purposes, but all of the components have a little button up at the top that says Make Public. And if I click the button, it says, are you really sure you want to make this public? And if I say yes, then that part of the project is public. And so I can continue to work on my project while making different parts of it, whatever parts I'm prepared to or can make available, make it publicly accessible. And so that private workflow for lab management is simultaneously integrated with a public workflow, and there's no extra work to make things publicly available. It also integrates things like incentives for openness. Why is it that I want to be open? Well, the things that I can appeal to myself for wanting to be open is seeing how many people download the work that I do. Having the opportunity for people to fork my project and make use of it themselves. Forking is a concept imported from open source software development that is a functional citation. You did something that I can adapt and use, so I will fork what you have done. I will make some adaptation of it for some new use, right? Some new design of this particular study, some new methodology that's inspired by yours or developed on top of yours. But there's always a functional link back to the origin. And so as different methodologies or different data sets evolve over time with many different contributors, you can trace the history through the network of how it is that work was done to see an originator's influence on the development trajectory of a particular type of research or phenomenon. It also has persistent citable identifiers that link to the content of the identifier rather than just being a link to where content might persist. So every piece of every component, every project, every comment, everything that's done on the Open Science Framework has a unique identifier to preserve that content. And citations are automatically generated to facilitate the idea that making more of one's research process available, not just the publication, but also the data set, materials, and otherwise, those are scholarly objects themselves that are deserving of citation and credit as contributions, just as the publication is. And also, you can add DOIs and other more standard persistent identifiers. So I'll do two more features and then move on to the other parts. And one is registration. So there are different points in the research life cycle that are important, that I want to call out as this is a point in time that is worth paying attention to and preserving. And so with the Open Science Framework, if I am, for example, at the point of getting ready to start data collection, and I want to say this was the state of the project as data collection commenced, right? Here's the design, here's our analysis plan, here's all the things that we think we're going to do. Data collection's about to start. I can register the project, sort of provide some metadata about what the project is for, why we're doing it, what the plan is, and then it creates a permanent archived version of the state of the project at that point in time. So I can continue to work on the project and change things, but I have a registered version that's archived and put into our long preservation store so that none of that information for that time will ever be lost. And it's date and time stamped as registries do to sort of provide some independent assurance of when and what was happening. Last is drawing on that services ecosystem. It connects all of those services together, but it provides an interface so that if I am using GitHub for my code, Amazon storage, simple storage for some large files, and Dropbox for my everyday files, I can connect all of those together in a single interface and just drag and drop and interact between them, rather than having to jump to lots of different services and potentially lose information or memory about where things are and how to access things if different users are using each of those different services. Okay, so that's OSF.io, but that's just one interface that can be built on that core set of services. We also have a variety of other services that we are building as examples of interfaces that can be built. But because this is all open source, the community can decide, I have an interface, I have an idea, I have a different way in which I would draw on those services to represent the scholarship or the research process that is of interest to me. So I want to give just a couple examples. One, OSF institutions. So we have an institutional view where if an institution wants better discovery of research that's happening by scholars at their institutions, if they want to facilitate researchers' ease of getting into the system, then we just create we connect with single sign-on if they have an OAuth type of connection so that researchers can log in with their own university accounts. And we have a face page for those universities to be able to track what research is being done and made available on the Open Science Framework. So that is, like all of our services, a free service. And so we have a variety of institutions that have signed up for that and have now their own interfaces for engaging with the Open Science Framework and facilitating researchers' engagement with the service. But that sort of leads to the top layer, which is the community services aspect of this, which is putting these services in the hands of the communities themselves to have their own governance and standards for how it is they work with these services. So I want to give an example of that with OSF preprints. So we launched this service earlier this fall, which is an open preprint repository network, and that's the address. But it draws on a few key pieces of those underlying layers. The first is that the search in the preprint service is not search of just preprints on OSF, but search of preprints across any preprint provider. So here are the ones that are connected so far, so that it's an aggregator of preprints wherever those preprints are stored. And so this draws on the share service that connects all of these services together into a single format. And so search goes on arXiv, bioRxiv, cogprints, engarchive, PRJ, scIarchive, repec, sociarchive for now. And then as more things get added to share, then they're also represented in that search. It also has a very simple workflow for adding one's own preprints so that you can post preprints very easily to accelerate communication. The OSF version of it is for any discipline, is agnostic just to facilitate sharing of preprints wherever you are. But the key part is that that interface can be branded for any community. So we have open invite for partnerships of different groups that want to start to promote preprints in their particular community, whether it is disciplinary, social sciences, whether it is topical. There is a group for open optism that is going to have a preprint service, or whether it is institutional. And so the sociarchive is one branded version of that preprint service. This should release today, is what I hear from the team. Likewise, today should come out Engineering Archive and Psych Archive for psychology. So all of them have their own steering committees, their own standards for what is content-wise can be included in their service, and they have minimized their infrastructure costs because of the shared infrastructure that supports all of them. So they don't have to reinvent any of that. They can focus on their community and engagement with their community. So just to illustrate what preprint looks like, so there's the preprint as it's shown in the browser. It pulls on the file rendering tools that are part of that core service. It draws on the OSF projects themselves and uses all of the contributor tools that are there. It has links to DOIs if the article is published so that you can represent it there, and then tags and things for simplified discovery. So that model applies to that overall model that I described at the beginning. We have that core set of tools that enable the creation of a preprints interface on top of it that draws on those tools. And then there are branded interfaces, community-based interfaces, using that sort of core interface to make it easier for communities to engage their researchers, their people in their community on those services. From our strategic perspective, The reason to do these layers is partly for efficiency, but also for allowing experts to be experts. As a psychologist, I might think I want to create a preprint service, but in order to create a preprint service, I have to build all these tools that aren't really my interest. I'm interested in scholarly communication in my community. And so by layering these as independent entities that can be built on one another, we can let technical experts do the technical work of how is it that you deal with multiple concurrent interactions, moving to scale for data storage and transfer. There's a lot of hard things that at scale the technology needs to be able to do and do very efficiently and effectively. And that's not something that a psychologist, me, cares about. That's something that they care about. And so let them be expert at those tools. Scholarly communication experts care about how is it that we are interacting? How is it that we are trying to get people around this research life cycle? Let them have their expertise in thinking about those interfaces. How is it that scholars should engage with their research, design those interfaces, and then make those interfaces available to the content domain experts to engage their communities. And so by segmenting them, we get lots of efficiency by cost, but also efficiency by allowing experts to focus on their areas of expertise and interest, rather than saying, oh, well, I have to do these things in order to get the thing that I want.
Brian, can you make sure, I know there's a question and answer part, but I just want to make sure you're clarifying on this. So what you're basically doing is saying, platform because you're feeding in, I want to create a preprint server in this area. You're basically help you get up and running in
tomorrow. So you send the logo, you send the phrase that you want, so I'll back up to this thing, right? You send us this logo and the name, you send us this phrase, you tell us, it's not shown below, but you tell us what are the relevant disciplines for you, and then we set it up, and then you have it.
how many have done that so far?
So we have those 3 will launch today, I think, and there are 3 more that are signing the agreement for us to offer those services. And then there are a number of others that have expressed interest, but they're organizing their communities. So we have that for preprints, but you can instantly, now that we have all these tools, you can imagine at this layer generalizing that. So the next thing that will be coming out is registries. Let's make it so that anybody can create a registry of what's happening in their research domain. So it draws on these same tools. It has very similar interface as preprints, but now it has particular about that registration process of documenting what it is that the research is going to be. And we have partners with EGAP and RIDE already to move their registries into this service. And we have our own registries that we already operate that will be integrated there. But same concept, dramatically lowering the barriers so that these groups can focus on what is it that's important to register in developmental economics? What do we have to say about the research process that we're doing in these RCTs? And they answer those questions of what's the content of it, while these services worry about how is it that it actually gets executed and gets done. Okay, so that, how much time do I have for? 7 minutes. You don't want to open that up because I really like that. So let me talk just in the last 7 minutes about sort of the direction that we're going with this. So those services are intended to provide more access, make it lower the barrier to entry to doing more open things. The longer term strategy is to address 2 challenges, I think, to openness. And that is rooted in the idolization of publication as the thing for advancement. So one is to separate publication of scholarly content from evaluation of that content. Right now, all of my incentives are get it published because that's the mechanism of reward for me. And so for researchers, if we can separate the concept of publication from evaluation, then what we're doing is separating what is really the basis of reputation management and reward, evaluation of the quality of my research, from what is right now just confounded with it but not essential for it, which is the publication of that, the sharing of that in the broader community. And preprints already does that, right? Preprints essentially is publishing before evaluation has occurred. The second is that the publication model as it currently exists doesn't treat scholarly content as a public good. The basis of most monetization strategies about publication are on controlling access to that content rather than making it openly accessible. So you can imagine how this community of preprint services can evolve. So as more preprint services become available, then they all develop different standards, different norms for what it is that's content, the kind of content that they host. And as a consequence, each of them develop reputations, not just for the content domain, but for their quality standards, for their evaluation standards of what kinds of research gets in. And so what we're building right now to enhance these preprint services is a comments and discussion pane so that you can interact, anybody in the community can interact about that preprint right where the preprint is, aligned with post-publication peer review, right? If you consider the preprint made available, now there can be peer review discussion, perhaps peer review discussion just before you submit it to a formal journal for formal peer review process. So that is in active development now. And then we're also in the planning stages for building evaluation and moderation tools for preprint services to employ before they include it in their service. So, our, Social Archive, they'll let any social science in. I'm going to start a social science peer preprint service that's really focused on methodology and have a high bar. The methodology has to be really solid before I let it into our preprint service. And so I have an evaluation system where we do peer review and we decide, is this worth including in our service? Once those two things are done, then by and large, this is publication, right? It's the entire publication system. And if we add, it's too low here to see, so I'll say, some key features of this in order to facilitate openness are that the authors retain licensing. So the author says it's CC BY or CC 0. They're not passing the license over to the preprint service. Articles are versioned. Remember version control. So there's no finished article. I can continue to revise based on the feedback that the community gives about the quality of that work, rather than right now the model of once challenges or things to improve in an article identified, if I'm motivated to do it, I write a comment, and that comment is published as a separate thing, which is never discovered when people are looking at the original thing. And it opens up the opportunity to diversify evaluation heuristics. So how is the information about the quality of that work communicated? Right now, the heuristic that is most accessible is the grade level of the journal. Is that an A journal? Is that an A- journal? Is that a B journal? And what I do in my publication process is I submit to them serially until I get it into one. Right? It's an A, no, it's not an A. A-, no, it's not an A-. B+, no, it's not a B+. And so this is a huge waste of time for everybody. So you can imagine a service that instead of assigning a grade level, it says we're going to assign the score. Submit it to one service, and they say, you got a 75. Right? That's a C. And I say, am I okay with a C? At least I got that information quickly. It's a C. But I think it's better. And so I respond to the reviews, I make changes, and I resubmit it thinking that I can increase my grade. Right? And so you can have a much more efficient process of evaluation, which we use as the heuristics for publication more generally, by allowing diversification and innovation on how evaluation happens in an open system. The other implication of authors licensing is that it breaks the one-to-one model of one journal or one article is in one journal. So if I am holding the license, then all of these are becoming evaluation services. They're not the publication services. So I could submit to multiple of these that have different reputations, that reach to different communities, that have different interested users. And all of them could provide their own evaluation. And all of those could be a basis of reputation enhancement of what the quality of the work is. So there's a lot that can be done once there is an open set of services for innovation in how scholarly communication happens. And so really, if we're thinking about it as preprint service, it's really now community of article services. It's preprint as a term becomes less relevant. Okay, so we're close enough to done. So I just want to close with sort of what our hope is for a public goods infrastructure like this will do. One is that ensures that the content and data are open. They're always accessible, rather than variably accessible or not at all accessible. Our goal is to promote monetization of commercial services on providing service, not on controlling access. So if we can create a core set of services, that services ecosystem that any service can connect to, but no service has control of the entire research lifecycle, then what the services are doing is competing for users. what additional things can they provide to the researchers to make themselves more efficient, to make them more effective. And that's what should be the basis of charging, rather than once I get you in to my suite of services, then I keep you in my suite of services. It also promotes interoperability by having a single ecosystem. It's in my interest as a service provider to make sure that my stuff works and connects with all of the other services. And as we talked about with the preprint example, it can massively increase the efficiency of creating and maintaining those services. Any group right now that wants to start a preprint service doesn't need to think about the technology. They just need to think about how their community can interact with it. And then obviously, by having public goods infrastructure, search, discovery, and aggregation can improve dramatically. And ultimately, we promote innovation in scholarly communication. Right now, it's very hard to innovate in scholarly communication because the mechanisms of scholarly communication are controlled by particular organizations that are doing very well in the system as it exists. And so there isn't a lot of motivation for innovation in the broader scope. But an open platform facilitates that more dramatically. So I will stop there so that we have a little bit of time, perhaps, for questions. And you can look at pictures of the Center for Open Science while we talk. Thank you.
We do have a few minutes for questions for Brian. There are people at the front and the back of the room with microphones. So if you have questions, please look for the microphone.
There's a mic right there.
Hi. So fantastic and inspiring and wonderful. Two quick questions. So what's the response to people, though, in terms of getting them to move over to an open, to SOC archive or one of the open preprint archives in terms of maintaining their reputation scores? So in other words, the big challenge is I delisted myself from SSRN 10 years ago because of SSRN's controlled access policies, the refusal in particular to allow me to include a hyperlink in an abstract. So I am proud of having waged that battle, but I shot myself in the foot professionally because I have no download scores from SSRN. So I think the question is, from an incentive perspective for individual users, how do you persuade people to move? The second quick question has to do with integration with or any relationship with Vivo, because you're building these enormous communities, and the question of how you then build up, again, access to the reputation of the people. How do we connect into and make more usable the knowledge and know-how of these communities that may come in part from, again, their articles, but again, what's back of those articles is some fabulous people. So I think the open source reputation systems like Vivo might be an interesting, I'm just curious if that's an interesting play, or there might be some other play there to tap into the expertise that people have.
Yeah, great. Thank you for those questions. To take the second one first, there is one Vivo integration as those grants that we gave for integrations to the services ecosystem. Because I agree with you, the kinds of data and material available about individuals in those kinds of services could be really useful to connect to the actual content of the things that they have contributed, which is the real aim with that. But that's still in the piloting phase or development phase, so there's nothing integrated yet. On the first question of persuading people to use these services or how they use those services, we are taking as the technology provider, which is really what we see as our role in this, is a very open-ended approach of meet researchers where they are. So, for example, using the Open Science Framework, it has open in the title, but it doesn't require openness at all. Researchers can use it entirely privately for their entire life if they want. They never have to make anything accessible. Instead, we try to solve a problem that they have today with those services, and then make it super easy to go open. And then, so relating closer to the preprints point, the goal is give researchers tools that they can use to be better at their research as they do it now, and provide access points to transition to a more open workflow across the entire research lifecycle whenever they see it as in their interest to do so. We don't have to persuade them. There's other forces. There's lots of other forces that can persuade. We just provide the services to make it easy so that they can see, I can now share this preprint early. I can get downloads, and there's these ratings out there that provide some reputation enhancement for me. I see it as in my interest to do that. So that's really the approach, at least that we have from our organization, but are working with others that are pushing on the incentives themselves more directly. Questions? Yes, please.
It's amazing. Thank you. It'll be even more amazing if these structures you've built persist over the centuries. So could you talk a little bit about how you're funded and what the long-term
The
stability
sustainability
of it is?
plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our sustainability model is to work really fast. Figuring that'll solve it, right? No. Okay. So there's a key question. So there are a couple of things. Our funding right now is about 8 different funders, some federal, so we have NIH and NSF and DARPA funding, and then a number of private foundations. So Laura and John Arnold Foundation, John Templeton Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, for example. And we're continuing to fundraise. Our operating budget right now is about $6.5 million a year. The sustainability model, so one key thing for the design of these tools is that we're trying to make sure that it shouldn't matter if we continue to exist. And so we have, all of the stuff is open and accessible. We are creating 90s style mirroring tools so that anybody can create a mirror of the content that's available as public access for the OSF. We established, right in our first year, a $250,000 preservation fund. So if we were to disappear, that fund would support a read-only version of all of the data that's hosted. For now, that's pretty much, for given the amount of data we have, that's enough for in perpetuity, for whatever that means. But the overall cost model, there's a funding models that we are developing for the transition from, right now we are moving out of proof of concept phase and into moving to scale phase. So we anticipate that we will be largely foundation federally funded for the scaling phase. But then if it works and it becomes shared public goods infrastructure that we all have a stake in, then we can have a distributed cost model, right? So every group, based on how much they use, their size, their resources, contributes some to a community-governed infrastructure. So that would be the point at which COS would not be the governing body of these kinds of tools, but would hand it over to a community of stakeholders. And if COS continued to exist, it would just be like a technical partner to help maintain those services. Yes, please.
Currently, one of your institutions?
No, Yale doesn't have an OSF institutions account, but we could do that really fast if that's of interest. But yeah, there's been lots of conversations and potential collaborations developing across the university here. And I'm personally motivated, given my academic history, to make that happen. Good question. So it depends on the goal. So we have collaborations directly with universities, particularly for facilitating engagement by researchers and then facilitating discovery of content, right? So institutional repositories at different universities, that's been where most of the collaboration has been, connecting their IRs to share so that metadata feed occurs. Deeper integrations are if there are data storage services that the university is providing, that can be integrated with the OSF. And then when researchers from that institution log into their account, their own institutional data storage service is right there as part of their part of each of their projects, right? So there are lots of deep possibilities with universities. At the disciplinary level, it's really more about the community norms and incentives for how it is that research gets done there. So preprint services, by and large, we'll likely engage with societies because that's really where more of the how do we share scholarship and what kind of scholarship gets shared happens, right? We don't tend to pay attention to scholarship done at our institution because it's going across lots of disciplinary boundaries that I'm in my silo. I'm just going to keep thinking in my silo. Please.
The point is you don't need the university. We'll engage with you. I'm going to talk to you later. Our group will engage with you. We'll do whatever we can to promote everything you're doing because we believe in it. We're not going to wait for the university because that just is often too long to wait. I think it'd be wonderful if Steve jumps up and if we join in a robust way, but I don't think anybody here should think your whole premise is you don't have to wait for the institutions, and I think the innovation is going to come bottom up, not top down. And I think if we wait for policies from the university rather than doing the right thing, then we'll wait a long time for many institutions, not ours, of course, which will show great leadership soon in this area.
I think I should step back.
I'm saying that truthfully. I know Stephen, and by the way, the physicists are the ones who like
Oh, yeah.
the astronomers. So
Yeah, for sure.
He knows this better than anyone, that if he's got any problem, it's that people in medicine have got a tradition, and in other places in the university, of not sharing openly. So it's actually not a will. I mean, Steve comes from a tradition where there. So that wasn't a diss on our leadership. It's how you round up a faculty that has very disparate and is worried about promotion. By the way, the practical issues of promotion are a thing that is a major lever that holds back, because you get something in New England Journal, get something in JAMA, people take that as a medal, even though we know the reproducibility of the peer review process is not very good. But you figure on average, stochastically, you throw a bunch at them, they take some, you'll get promoted. And so we've got to change a whole range of different things. But at the leadership of the universities, I think there's a misperception that they can just impose their faculty feel that. But the truth is, they've got to deal with the entire faculty. It's got lots of different opinions and proclivities with regard to sharing. So I think the best thing we can do to help support our leadership is to showcase studies within the university.
That's right.
And others. Show that this is a safe and honorable and virtuous approach. And it gives the university leadership some ability then to move forward. I mean, that's the reality of what happens in universities. He can't really move. If left out here and then the whole university screaming and yelling, the faculty aren't with him, it's a so and there's very little that can be imposed top down in a university, honestly. You have to show as a community, not wait for Peter to say this is what Yale's doing and then have everyone fight. There are these things we've got to comply with, but I can tell you, it brings people kicking and screaming. That's why even I was kidding Kieran when he said that, but the feeling about those are unfunded mandates kicking and screaming rather than winning the day on arguments. And what you're saying, let me build the tools, let's see if people will come. I'm hoping that that's a better way than imposing from NIH, this is what you must do.
Right.
Our community needs to step forward and do it.
Minimally, both need to happen, right? Because if you don't have that bottom-up development, then the top-down solutions are just going to be bureaucratic nightmares from the researcher's perspective.
Wants to do this,
Yeah.
and then the leadership can watch and see, okay, how's this go? And we can get, they'll be supportive, but are people coalescing around these values and issues?
Can you speak a little bit more about in your preprint service or in some of the data about the quality control? Because more data includes wonderful data and also more crap.
Yeah.
So whatever the virtues and weaknesses of the peer review system are, it is how we have come to identify the higher quality data. And particularly in the biomedical sciences, the conduct of the study and the collection of the data is critical to whether we should continue to use that data set. So I'm not sure I understand how your preprint service differs from peer review in recognized journals. Who are those people doing those reviews, and how do we peer review those reviewers?
Yeah. So good questions. The quality control is essentially the core function, a filtering mechanism of the peer review process, right? What's worth reading? And whatever its flaws, that has some value. So the preprint services, the communities themselves that launch their preprint service decide on their own quality control standards. So Archive, for example, has a standard of, is it science? And does a reviewer that has some expertise in that discipline read it and say, yep, that's scholarship that fits the broad parameters of what we are willing to share. And it has been very effective, right? That's a long-standing, now, it's 400,000 submissions, or no, it's less than that. But there's like 1.2 million preprints on Archive now. And that's been very effective. BioArchive has its own set of standards for what it is that it will include in its preprint service. So our goal is to facilitate the creation of many services. You'll say, oh, BioArchives isn't really good enough for what I want to do. I'm going to start my own, and we'll have a different set of criteria, and then let the marketplace decide whether yours is more worth looking at than BioArchives is worth looking at. For us, it doesn't matter. We just want to facilitate the creation of different ways of doing that evaluation, that filtering. And just like how we absorb our news, the services will provide information about what's worth paying attention to. If it's in Huffington Post versus in New York Times, I might have different assumptions about whether that information is worth reading. And the same will be true of these kinds of services. So we won't impose it from the technical provider. Yeah, please.
Yes. First of all, I just want to say, in principle, I applaud what you're doing, and I think it is overall a wonderful thing. But I was wondering if you've, and this is more of an existential question, right? And as an example, in the aftermath, of the election, one of the lobbying groups that's gotten a lot of attention is a conservative group that seeks to cut government funding for what they consider to be wasteful research, and they're seeking to align with animal rights groups, right? To say right now their target is to cut dog research done by the NIH, and they've made it very clear they want to eventually just cut funding for all animal research across the board, for any government funded. Having an open, like I know that at Yale, the university cautions us about putting any animal experiment images that might be accessible to the public, because that could be used against the university. Lab members could get stalked, right? And I was wondering, there's a possibility that your tool may actually stifle the very innovation that you seek to propagate. And I understand it's not an easy question, and there's no answer for that, but I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that is a very important one, is that any move to a culture change will have unintended consequences that are hard to anticipate. And so incremental revolutions are good because they allow correction along the way, right? You do one step, you see what happens, you make corrections, you do another step. And so that, I think, is really where the whole reproducibility and openness movement is going, if it goes effectively, is really trying and testing, and then making sure that the kinds of risk situations are addressed effectively, like what gets shared, right? I have a colleague that does research on abortion and psychological effects of abortion. And of course, the same sorts of concerns come up. How can I possibly share some of this stuff? This is very, it is so politicized that there's lots of risks for doing that. And so we have to have no single imposed solution is going to be the right solution. There'll be lots of occasions where we say some of this needs to remain closed. And it doesn't necessarily mean entirely closed. It may mean closed with permission to access, right? And so who is it that gets access to that kind of content or that kind of work? And so all systems need to be any open system, its top priority has to be security because some stuff can't be open. And when you have an integrated system that has some stuff open and some stuff not, security is priority one because of exactly the kinds of issues that you raised. Thanks.
About practicality and encryption, I saw you have some website pages that probably are the platform are using the security protocol. Do you have any encryption between the APIs, especially for data storage and project management? Because when you describe your project, you're a bit aware of your competition as well, and you rather have that good encrypted.
Yes, so there are a variety of encryption standards. We don't encrypt the data, stored data now. There are hosting solutions that are other hosting solutions that do that. There are some pluses and minuses of encrypting the data as the data, but that's going into some weeds. So there are encryption standards, and there are also things that are privacy standards that one can do eventual openness. So I didn't mention in the registry service, if I want to register my designs in advance, have a clear confirmatory design, but I'm worried about competition from other people in the field, I can embargo my registration. So I register, it will become available sometime in the next 4 years, whatever date I select, but it can stay private until that time. So that I can still show I did register this in advance, but still have the value of a registry that makes it available over time. So it's really trying to be sensitive to the community as it exists now and make it super easy to transition in different ways depending on how the issues of openness evolve. So thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.